Hello, everyone. Welcome. I see several community college leaders signing in. We are going to get started in just a moment after we have critical mass joining the session. Good afternoon and good morning, community college leaders. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here at our second of the preparation webinars for the Community College National Legislative Summit. And we are less than a week away from the start of our event. This year, we are thrilled to share that we are likely to have record attendance gathering together in Washington, D.C. And as I know you all know, there has been no shortage of news out of Washington over the past few weeks. So there is much to cover. And we are glad today to be releasing our community college joint priorities with ACCT and AACC for the next Congress, or the Congress that has now begun, the 119th Congress. My name is Carrie Warwick-Smith. I'm Vice President for Public Policy here at the Association of Community College Trustees, and I'm glad you've all joined us today. Next slide. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by my colleagues, David Bain, who's Senior Vice President for Government Relations at the American Association of Community Colleges, Jim Hermes, Associate Vice President for Government Relations, also at AACC, and my colleague here at AACC, excuse me, and my colleague here at ACCT, Jose Miranda, who is our Director of Government Relations. And today we're going to have two parts of our presentation. First, we will go through the top items from the Community College Legislative Priorities, the ones that are highlighted on the green sheet, which is now live on the NLS website. And I think Jose is going to put the link in there in the chat for you to check out. So we are going to go through those items, and then we're also going to do some tips and reminders for folks to help prepare you for next week. So with that, welcome again, and I will turn it over to my colleague, David.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're looking forward to seeing so many of you in Washington next week. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about process and then get into some of the issues that we're working on, as Carrie just described. Before I do that, let me say that as Carrie mentioned a minute ago, there's a tremendous amount going on right now in Washington. A whole lot of it is emanating from the Trump administration, from actions that they have taken so far in just the 2 weeks and 1 day that they've been in office. However, the bulk of this presentation is going to be about our affirmative agenda, the things that we're trying to accomplish in Congress. And despite an environment that presents some obstacles and some challenges, we also think there are some real opportunities within that at this time. So again, the gist and the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today is our positive agenda for things that we're hoping to achieve. I'm going to start by talking about the budget reconciliation process. That process is a process. It's got a lot of complicated rules behind it. But the basic thing to understand about it is that it's a legislative preference that's given to certain types of bills. That means that those bills can be passed, that legislation can be passed with just 51 votes in the Senate. And so the key thing there is that there's no need for the Republican majority in the Senate of 53 votes right now to work with the Democrats. And so when you have a trifecta that the Republican Party now has having both chambers of Congress under their control, and of course the White House, they are able to move this reconciliation legislation again without any Democratic votes. Having said that, they can't move all legislation that way. That would essentially be if we had eliminated the filibuster outright, which Majority Leader Thune has indicated he is not planning on doing, does not want to do. So, as I mentioned, only certain kinds of legislation can be considered under these special reconciliation rules. And it's essentially bills that have a direct impact on spending as opposed to bills that would change laws where the focus is more on the policy rather than spending. And with reconciliation as well, it's a particular type of spending, which is what they call mandatory direct spending that falls under that category. There are a lot of things, in fact, that we care a lot about that are outside of reconciliation, things like the basic Pell Grant program, TRIO Gear Up, the Perkins Act, all those things are outside of reconciliation. So reconciliation does have a very broad but circumscribed area and type of issues that it can include. And as this slide mentions, there are different approaches in the House and the Senate at this point in time in terms of how they handle this legislation. And we are talking about massive a bill that will be well over $1 trillion within the context of a federal budget that's a little bit under $5 trillion. And the House has indicated that it would like to do what the president wants to do, which is move one, as he calls it, beautiful, large bill. The Senate has already mapped out a strategy of moving two bills, and that's what this slide refers to. The Senate, if it does move two separate bills, the House will probably go first. The Senate bill would focus on President Trump's top priorities of immigration, border security, and national security. The second one would be on tax legislation, whereas the House would bundle all those provisions together. One final aspect of reconciliation, and some of it is mentioned on the next slide, is that the process works that the Republican majority in the Congress will pass a budget resolution, and a budget resolution is what sets the reconciliation train in motion. That budget resolution will include directions to the scope, really all of the congressional committees to change programs under their jurisdiction to comply with the mandates or the budgetary targets that are included in that budget resolution. So for our purposes, and some of this is on the next slide, for our purposes, the Budget Committee will pass a resolution. Both chambers will have to cooperate in that and compromise. And then the tax committees, the education committees primarily will get what they call instructions to change programs under their jurisdiction. And those instructions could require literally hundreds of billions of dollars in reductions. There's a lot of negotiations that are going on now behind the scenes about what those instructions should look like. Okay, so that's a little bit about process, and I understand it's fairly complicated. Within that process, though, there are certain pieces of legislation, certain issues that will be considered in all likelihood that are of intense interest to our students and our campuses. And there are 5 altogether on reconciliation priorities in that last bullet on this slide. I'm just going to focus on 3 of them. The first one is the first bullet on the oppose, and then I'm going to talk about the other 2 in terms of support. In terms of opposing, our number one concern about what might happen in this reconciliation process, in which Republicans will be able to move this legislation again without any Democratic votes, is a possible effort by authorizers, as the Education and Workforce Committee in the House, the Help Committee in the Senate, to impose some kind of a risk-sharing requirement on institutions. And risk sharing has taken different forms over time. We're not exactly sure what might be done. The College Cost Reduction Act, which was championed by Representative former Chair Virginia Foxx last year, had a set of provisions that would have essentially levied a fee or a payment by institutions, depending on the repayment of their students, that may or may not be followed in this reconciliation process. But the underlying concept behind it is maybe most important for you as our lobbyists to understand, and that concept is that institutions should be held responsible financially for aspects of their performance. It might be the repayment, as I mentioned, of their students. It might be something related to their completion rates, which is something that was proposed back in 2019. It might be something that's related to defaults, but which was even earlier than that. But the basic idea is that there is a lot of momentum in Congress, particularly in the Republican Party, but not exclusively limited to that, of people who think that colleges should have some skin in the game. And so we want you to go up to offices in the hills, on the Hill, and say that this is a very bad idea. We don't know how we would come up with these funds. We think that this is punitive, and we think that it's counterproductive to our mission of serving students. We also think that institutions that have lower levels of resources and serve higher percentages of low-income students are those that are going to be most impacted by risk sharing. Those of you who've been with us before are familiar with this issue and know why we don't like it. So that's a negative, no risk sharing. There are two things, however, that we are advocating for within the reconciliation process that we think could be wins for us. One, I'll get into, actually both of these I'll talk about in a little more detail in just a minute, but both of these items would probably be handled through the reconciliation process. That is the tax-free Pell Grant, which is in the tax domain, obviously, a very high priority for us. And then the other one is the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. So why don't we move on to the next slide? We're going to talk about workforce issues, and we can get into that. Yeah. So workforce legislation. As I mentioned, the first item there that we're focusing on is the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act and the Jobs Act. And this is the second bullet, a big bullet on this slide here. The committees that will be managing this legislation are ones that I just mentioned, the Health and Education and Workforce committees. So most of you, I'm sure the vast majority of you, are familiar with our efforts to try to enact legislation that would create eligibility for short-term programs on our campuses. Those are programs that would be from 8 weeks to 15 weeks and basically between 1/3 of a year and 2/3 of a year. Programs, they would have to be at least 8 weeks in length, which is an issue for us, and meet a variety of other requirements. We have been through substantial legislative efforts with many of you supporting those efforts to try to get and secure broad-based bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress for the short-term workforce Pell eligibility. The House tends to call it workforce Pell, the Senate short-term Pell. The House bill is the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. The Senate bill, which has been introduced, is the Jobs Act, and that too has bipartisan support. So when you go into offices next week, many of you, we want you to communicate the importance of establishing this new eligibility for these short-term workforce programs. The cost of this new eligibility is very small relative to the overall cost of the Pell Grant program. It's only about 1% of the cost of the whole cost of the Pell Grant program. So we're not talking about a lot of money, but we are talking about a lot of impact on community college campuses. So later in the presentation, we talk a little bit about information for you to present to offices, and we would strongly encourage you to provide some data about your short-term workforce programs that you would like to see federal support for. And then the other workforce item that we're asking people to lobby on is the reauthorization of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, commonly known as WIOA. That was a bipartisan bill that came very close to being enacted at the end of the last Congress. It was included in the so-called continuing resolution that was going to be voted on by Congress. There were some 11th hour interventions by the incoming Trump administration and its representatives that caused the parameters of that bill to be limited. And in that process, the Bipartisan Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act got left on the cutting room floor, as it were. That bill was a bill that we supported, both of our associations, primarily, or its big positive feature for us was because it put into statute the Strengthening Community College Training Grant Program, which many of you have received funding for. And it's a partnership program between our institutions, business, and the workforce system. And we think it's a really good program, and we wanted to see it included in the law. That didn't happen. So that program is currently being funded on an annual basis through the appropriations process, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's a little bit about the workforce priorities that we are. Again, we have two primary ones, the short-term Pell Grants or bipartisan workforce Pell and the WIOA reauthorization. And then let me talk about a final issue here, and that is in the area of tax policy. Thank you, Jose. So this is another issue that we've been working on for some time, and we believe that we have a great opportunity in the context of budget reconciliation to get the tax-free Pell Grant set into statute. The tax-free Pell Grant is a bill that has two primary features. One, it makes all of the Pell Grant non-taxable. And for community college students who have tuition and required expenses that are below their amount of their Pell Grant, they're subject to taxation on the remainder. So if you have a student who's paying, say, $4,000 in tuition and required fees, and they're getting a $7,395 Pell Grant, which is the current maximum, they have to pay, at least as report as taxable income, the remaining $3,395, which we think is very bad public policy and undermines the whole purpose of the Pell Grant program. The other thing that the tax-free Pell Grant would do is to enable students who get a Pell Grant and have low tuitions, that is to say, our students would qualify for the $2,500 American Opportunity Tax Credit. And due to some complicated eligibility rules, it is really only our Pell Grant recipients who aren't eligible for this tax credit, which we also think is a very wrong-headed policy. You have students whose families are earning over $150,000 a year, writing tuition checks of, say, $30,000 and getting the full $2,500 tax credit, whereas our students, our Pell Grant students, are getting nothing. So obviously, we think that that's a misguided policy. Before I turn things over, let me just talk a bit about the politics of this tax-free Pell Grant. This is legislation that will be worked on, hopefully when it's taken up in the House Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committees. It is, as I mentioned before, a process that will largely be driven by Republican members. So it is essential that all of you who have members from the Republican Party, majority members on the Ways and Means and Finance Committees, that you get to those members and communicate to them the importance of this tax change. It's a tax change that is only really directed at community college students. It is not universities. Universities are not particularly popular right now on Capitol Hill and in other places. So to emphasize that this is focused on community college students, our low-income students, is really important. And again, it's essential that we communicate this position to particularly Republican members of the tax writing committees. And as the slide says, the cost of the change would be relatively modest or very modest in terms of the overall tax provisions that impact higher education. There will be tax legislation this year, as the slide says. So those are a few of the major issues that we're working on, and I will turn things over now to Jose.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. I'm here to talk to you all about our perennial issue, one that Congress has to take action every year, even though they never do it on time. And before I start going over our specific ask or the specific things that we're looking on the appropriations process, I want to level set a little bit because there's been a lot of conversations and a lot of reporting going around regarding federal funding, and not everything it's quite exactly the same. So I'm going to try to differentiate and just provide a little bit of clarity on that regard. We are currently in fiscal year 2025, but operating under the funding levels of fiscal year 2024. As you all probably already know, the fiscal year ends in September 30th. It ended, and the new fiscal year starts October 1st. So this new fiscal year started on October 1st of last year. Unfortunately, Congress, as is the norm now, did not complete their responsibilities on the appropriations front by that deadline, which means they required a continuing resolution, essentially a permission to continue operating at the prior year's funding levels to avoid a government shutdown. They had an initial continuing resolution that extended to December. We were hopeful that they may be able to complete their appropriations work in December, given all the transition with the new Congress and a new administration coming. However, that did not come to pass, and so they passed the bill that David was referencing earlier in the presentation regarding the WIOA reauthorization was the next continuing resolution that was then enacted. That continuing resolution is extended until March 14th. So when you all come here next week, we will still be operating under fiscal year 2024 levels, and Congress will still be negotiating fiscal year 2025, even though February is when they should begin the process of negotiating or drafting their ideas for fiscal year 2026. This happened last year and the year before, where they finished around March and then immediately they turned over to work on the new fiscal year. And so the funding levels that we're asking for right now are for fiscal year 2025. We're going to get into fiscal year 2026 immediately after. That is separate from the budget reconciliation conversation that David mentioned as well. It's a little confusing because budget, appropriations, it all seems like it's the same. But one key difference is that with budget reconciliation, as David mentioned, it only touches on the mandatory side. It actually is not allowed to touch on the appropriations side. So the appropriations process has to be separate. I'm sure many of you all, as we heard from a lot of you, we're paying attention to what's happening from the administration side in terms of the attempts to freeze funding, to delay funding. They've had conversations about there's been question marks around existing funds or not. That is still ongoing, and that is tangentially related to appropriations, but not directly related to appropriations. One thing I will note, though, is that once Congress finishes fiscal year 2025, the first step to begin with fiscal year 2026 will be President Trump's budget for that fiscal year. And so we will probably see a lot of these ideas that we've heard or that we've seen from his executive orders reflected in his budget request. But we'll give you an update on that once we get to that point. So for appropriations for fiscal year 2025, we're operating under very tight funding caps that were established during the Fiscal Responsibility Act of about 2 years ago at this point. Those were the same funding caps that tied up fiscal year 2024. You may recall during the second half of last year, we were going back and forth between a House proposal that was very, very low with very steep cuts to the Department of Education and a Senate proposal that was not really an increase, but at least it maintained most of our programs at a level funding. There were some discrepancies where there were maybe 2 programs in the House where we were better off by the House proposal. All of that goes by the wayside because we're in a new Congress. The appropriations committees have to file a new budget, a new appropriations proposal. We believe that their starting negotiation points are still the blueprints that they introduced last Congress, but we haven't seen anything new. The latest we have is that, and this is the first step that's needed, what we call the 4 corners, the chairs and the ranking members of the Appropriations Committee on the House and the Senate need to agree on a top line number. There have been some years where that top line numbers comes all the way from the leadership, from the Speaker's office and the Senate Majority Leader. There has been other years where that is delegated to the chairs and the ranking members of the committees to negotiate amongst themselves. That seems to be the case for this year. Speaker Johnson and Leader Thune have given the chairs the green light to negotiate with their counterparts in the minorities, and they have engaged in those conversations for the last several weeks. But to our understanding, there is still no agreement on a top line number. That top line number will decide how those funds get divided into the 12 bills and whether there is money to maintain level funding or increases for a program. Now, I say all of that to say that more than likely, our best case scenario is if we can maintain some of the investments that we saw in the last fiscal year for appropriations. We are, of course, still going to ask for increases because the reality is that our students, our institutions need additional investments, which is why you see on the slide that we're asking for an increase to the Pell Grant maximum by at least $200 to keep up with inflation, as well as asking for increases in several programs. And the appropriation slide, I'm going to go on to the next one shortly, is pretty lengthy. We always struggle with trying to be focused, but understanding that the realities our institutions cover a wide spectrum of students, and as such, they leverage a wide spectrum of federal programs. So I always like to divide it into three buckets. The first bucket being student affordability. And so we look at programs like the Pell Grant, the Supplemental Education Opportunity Grants, as well as federal work study. And we're always going to ask for higher investment in those programs. Then we look at student success, and that is what do our institutions need to do in order to ensure that our students not only get through the door, but successfully persist and complete their programs. And we're looking at many supportive services, supportive grants, such as the Child Care Access Means Parents in School, the Post-Secondary Student Success Grant, the Basic Needs Grants, TRIO, Gear Up, if your institutions have some of that. And then the third bucket is the institutional capacity to serve and support our students. And that is what we see in our next slide, which is looking at Title III and Title V programs. The Title IIIA supporting institutions program, or the various grants that support minority serving institutions, tribal colleges, and HBCUs. This is a pretty long list. What I'll always encourage you all to do is to find those grants that your college is utilizing, that you are leveraging to support your students, and speak on those specific programs and speak on the value and the impact that those are having with your lawmakers. Outside of those, David mentioned the Strengthening Community College Training Grants earlier today when we talked about the reauthorization. This is one that we are the only two associations that are speaking on this program because it's going directly to our institutions. It's one where we've been lucky in the sense that it has strong bipartisan support. It started about 5 years ago now. It was funded first at $40 million. It's currently at $65 million. We're always asking for an increase. We know that in these times it's probably not likely that we'll get an increase, but we continue asking for an increase because given that the program is relatively new still, it's only reached 35 states. And now 35 states is more than half of the nation, but we believe that this is a program that should be reaching all 50 states and as many colleges as possible. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Jim for our next item on the green sheet.
Thanks very much, Jose. And the next item is, as you see here, the Farm Bill, one of the more recent entrants onto the green sheet for our NLS. And basically, we are looking to do three things within the Farm Bill. But before I get into those, I'll just talk a little bit about where we are on that. Sort of like the appropriations process, everyone calls the Farm Bill a must-do when it comes up for reauthorization. It's been up now for, I think, a couple of years and hasn't gotten done yet. Congress has extended it, so the programs don't lapse, but they haven't yet done a full-scale reauthorization of the Farm Bill. So that remains on the agenda for the 119th Congress, and hence, since President's still on our green sheet. So the first thing is to at least provide some good seed money for investments in community colleges' agricultural workforce programs. And there is a piece of legislation called the Community College Agricultural Advancement Act. And that bill would authorize $20 million for agricultural programs at our institutions. So really kind of a foot in the door of an area that has been dominated by agricultural extension programs and other programs at four-year universities, certainly in terms of federal funding. But that is what we're looking to do there. That bill has at the least been included in draft frameworks of the farm bills that we've seen to date and included in those legislation. But our job as advocates from here on out is to ensure that in a final farm bill, again, the Community College Agricultural Advancement Act or something very similar to it winds up in that final piece of legislation. The second item you see here is to combat food insecurity on campus by streamlining access to SNAP benefits for eligible students. So this is just another area really where the benefits that are available for students are going underutilized. It's a complex process for many of them to establish their eligibility, and it's also it's just hard for them to navigate through that process. And in some cases, the eligibility requirements themselves are a little more stringent than we'd like to see. So that's another aspect that we're hoping to see something along the lines of what happened during the COVID pandemic in terms of streamlining access to those benefits for college students in a reauthorized farm bill, so that they can get the help that many of them need. And we know that that it is a widespread issue on college campuses in terms of food insecurity. And then finally, we want to strengthen the SNAP employment and training program by disregarding income earned by recipients on earn and learn pathways. So the problem here is there you get on this pathway, and at some point you're earning enough and you lose your SNAP benefits as a result. So that's the main change that we want to see here in terms of that benefit cliff that occurs within the SNAP ENT program. There's also a piece of legislation on this embodying the changes that we want. That is the SNAP ENT Enhancements Act. So in terms of the Farm Bill overall, if you want to get really pithy, it's advancement and enhancements in terms of 2 to 3 things that we're looking for to really make it work better mainly for our students, but for our institutions as well. And that's another aspect of that final bill, is to make it a little bit easier for community colleges, as many of you do already, to play a role as a training provider within the SNAP ENT program. And then the next issue on the next slide, revolves around the issue of accountability. And here again, you can see that the committees of jurisdiction are the Health and Education Workforce Committees, as many of the items that we're talking about today are. And our main agenda item here, for those of you who are veterans of NLS will recognize, is to support the reintroduction and passage of the College Transparency Act. So that is a piece of legislation that creates a student-level data network at the federal level. Many of you have those at your state level. We do not have one at the federal level. Is in fact disallowed currently under the Higher Education Act. The thing to note here, politically speaking, in terms of the College Transparency Act, is that a couple of changes in the leadership changed the playing field a bit, so to speak. So with the flip in the party control in the Senate, we now have Senator Bill Cassidy as the chairman of the Help Committee there, and he is the main lead of the College Transparency Act in the Senate. So that is a priority for him. And, we hope that, the fact that he's the chairman now will mean that we'll make forward progress on that bill in the Senate. And then over on the House side, one of the main opponents of the College Transparency Act is former chairwoman of the Education Workforce Committee, Virginia Fox. So we got a little bit more of an unknown there in terms of our new committee chairman, Wahlberg, and where he puts the CTA on, in terms of his priorities, or whether it's a priority at all or not. The other thing to note there is that while Representative Fox is no longer the chairwoman of the committee, she is still on the committee and will certainly have an impact from that role. So as you can see, this is one issue that can't be included in reconciliation because it isn't in a budgetary item. So it is something we'll have to move in on some other vehicle, if not on its own. And then finally, outside of the Transparency Act, the other thing that we are looking for in a more general way is to ensure that any borrowing-related outcome measures, including the risk-sharing measures that we talked about before, while David made clear, we oppose risk sharing just outright. But any types of accountability measures that are, as it says here, borrowing related, we really want to make sure that those are reflective of the fact of the borrowing rates at institutions, and in particular, the fact that community colleges whose borrowing rates are in the low double-digit percentages, that really makes a big difference in terms of holding them accountable for measures that are based on a small sliver of their students in terms of being borrowers. So that is our agenda in terms of both the Farm Bill and accountability. And for the last issue in our green sheet, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie.
Thanks so much, Jim. Our last topical issue is immigration and the DREAM Act. So for many years, both ACCT and AACC have supported the DREAM Act, or legislation that would allow higher education to be part of a pathway to citizenship for immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. We have, at the guidance of our public policy committees and our board, kept that priority this year. It is, remains what we believe is the best thing for our students on our campus and for our institutions. However, that you may have sensed is coming is that, given the conversations happening nationally around immigration and the majorities in the House and the Senate at this time, we are not sure how much action this legislation might receive coming up at this time, but we want to continue to signal that we support all of our students on our campuses, and that should this type of immigration legislation and conversation come up, that it is one that we will certainly participate in. I will take just an aside here in comparison to our legislative agenda. We know that there have been many executive orders on this topic as well, and we will have a session at NLS covering that information, including with an immigration lawyer. So right now, today in this webinar, we're just focused on possible immigration legislation. And then there's one other new item that's not exactly an issue on the green sheet this year, but we told you last NOS that bipartisan members, Representatives Bilirakis and Courtney, decided to relaunch the Community College Caucus last Congress, and they have registered it again as an official caucus for this Congress. This caucus existed several years ago and has been dormant for quite a while, and so we were excited to see that Representatives Bilirakis and Courtney decided to revive this effort and to set a goal to help elevate community college needs, but also provide a forum for bipartisan discussion of issues related to community colleges, and a place where members of Congress, along with partners from the field, can share information back and forth about community colleges. So this is open to all members in the House of Representatives, and we are asking participants in NOS this year, when you have your meetings, to encourage any member who is supportive of community colleges, hopefully that's all of them, to officially join the caucus so that they have the opportunity to be invited to their events, to sign on to any joint letters they do, etc. So you will see that it is in the bottom line of the green sheet on the front page. We had some definite work to get everything on this year, but we have continued to keep everything on one piece of paper. So don't miss that on the bottom of the front page. All right, we're about to turn to the second part of our webinar, where we just go through some tips and reminders, but just a few quick logistic notes before we do that. One, I am very excited to see all the questions in the Q&A box. If you haven't asked one yet, now's a good time to get it in. Or if you don't have a question, some of the more specific ones we have answered just by typing a response. So I encourage you to read through those. And then we flagged a couple to answer live for questions that might need a little more discussion. And then also, if you look in the chat feature, there is a link to a specific page on the NLS website. And that is the resources page, which includes the green sheet and the full PDF version of our agenda brochure, both of which you will also get printed copies of at NLS. But there are also a lot of other really helpful materials and tips there. And we will be posting these slides and the recording to that same link as well. So bookmark it, check back often as you're getting ready for NLS. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David to kick off the tips and prep section.
Hello again. This slide just serves as a reminder of things that we hope that you're well on the way to completing if you haven't already completed them. And that's just pulling together both information about your campus, your students, your programs, your economic impact, and so on, as well as some anecdotes about what your college does well, because we know that there's both more of an outcomes aspect and an objective aspect to evaluating our colleges, as well as the stories that grab people's hearts. So we hope that you'll have all of that pulled together by the time you get to Washington. As part of the registration materials, we, as traditionally do, have provided a federal funds worksheet, which will enable you to clearly provide to members of Congress the impact of federal programs on your student body and on the programs that you offer. So that's all sorts of preparatory materials that we hope that you will gather. I think before I just leave you once again, just mention, as I did before, that it's really important now, it's been important for some time, but even more than ever, that we emphasize the fact that we're not universities. And I think probably it's helpful to use the term universities because they're the big institutions, the universities are, as I said, quite unpopular right now in Congress for a lot of reasons. Won't go into those now, but it's essential that we distinguish ourselves from the other types of institutions in higher education. In a lot of ways, we're joined with them in the hip in terms of the federal programs that benefit our students. Pell goes to the students attending the elite universities as well as all institutions across the country. So we're joined with them in that regard. On the other hand, as we try to make our case for programs, it's important that we talk about what sets us aside from the other sectors. Our low costs, our orientation to local employers, the fact that our faculty overwhelmingly teach and don't do research, the fact that we serve as cultural centers and community centers in many places. These are the things that members of Congress from both parties like and are important for us to emphasize. And this next slide is just an example of what one institution has done to leave as with off the offices that they visit, that describe in a lot of very graphic and compelling detail the impact that their institution has on their local community and of course their students.
Thank you, David. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the next part. And this is a lot of really reemphasizing a lot of what David just mentioned, which is, but and I've seen a couple of questions come up along these lines. The green sheet is pretty long. It's back and front, one whole sheet of paper. There's a whole lot of issues. I talked about appropriations and all the different programs that we list there. You need to prioritize. You need to keep in mind that on a best case scenario, your meeting is going to be 30 minutes long. It could be as short as 15 minutes. It could be planned for 30 minutes and end up being cut short because votes are called or something else happens. So you really need to hone in on what are some of the big key issue items that your college is facing, whether that's funding, whether that's federal financial aid or different grants that may be threatened. And even if they're not currently threatened, it's always an issue because we're always fighting for a small piece of the pie when it comes to the overall appropriations funding. It could be specific projects or specific initiatives that your campus has and how you need federal funding for those. Make sure you prioritize. Make sure that you're using some of the data that David mentioned to craft your arguments, craft your anecdotes. We highly encourage students to come to the NLS. We're very happy to report that we have over 100 students coming this year. Students are always going to be your best advocate because members of Congress are always going to resonate with the individual stories of students and the immediate impact that they see on students. So leverage them if you're bringing them with you. And help them drive that message across. And then try to find areas of synergy. Look at what committees your member sits on. Look at what are some of the top education priorities that they've worked on, whether that's through press releases, remarks that they've shared, events that they've attended. And if your college is engaged in any of those areas, make sure that you mention that. Make sure that that makes your college go to the top of their list in terms of allies, advocates, and programs that they want to support. Going on beyond the content of the meeting to the logistics of the meetings, make sure that you are clear on how many people can go to the meeting, especially if you're meeting in the house. Some spaces may be smaller than others. Some offices may have a cap on how many people can join. And once once you know how many people are going and who's going with you, make sure you assign different roles. Who is going to talk about Pell Grants? Who is going to talk about C Campus, who is going to talk about the impact that some of these executive orders may have on your institutions if they were to go through and funding were to be pulled. Make sure that you have those assigned so that there's a coordinated effort. Make sure you have someone who's taking notes. It's important to take notes because you will need that to follow up with them. And then what are some of the materials you're bringing? We are going to have plenty of green sheets for you to have and take with you. We're also going to have copies in your folders when you registered of the federal funds worksheet, but we hope that you would have already filled that out and you have that ready to share. If your college is creating their own one pager, as David showed in the example, make sure that you have enough copies and that you know where you're going, who you're going to leave them with, and so forth. So with that, I will turn it over to Jim.
Yeah, and then just kind of a couple other logistical type of things to keep in mind, particularly for those of you who are going to be new to this, is leave enough time for yourself. So it's a big place up on Capitol Hill. If you look at it on a map, you can see, oh, it's just a couple of buildings right next to each other, on the street. Those are big buildings. So, and unless you figure out the way to go from one to the other underground, you're going to be going in and outside of the security perimeter for each of the buildings. And sometimes that can really get backed up too. And particularly in the house side where we've seen a lot of construction, how that's actually limited the number of entrances into a couple of the buildings. See that a little bit on the Senate side as well. So keep that all in mind in terms of just getting around. It's good to arrive early. I would kind of add not too early, but arrive early and certainly at the very least be punctual for your meetings, particularly if you're meeting with the actual member of Congress, him or herself. They're not going to be able to stick around for you and wait for you. And as Jose mentioned, really kind of particularly in the House side, if you're meeting with the staffer, we usually plan as lobbyists, we usually plan on a half-hour meeting or so. And I think it's safe to say that if you're meeting with a member and their staffers, that might be a half-hour meeting, but the member, him or herself, might only be there for part of it. So keep that in mind as well in terms of hitting your real top priority while that member of Congress is in the room. And certainly, if a prior meeting is running late and you don't think you're going to get there on time for the next one, make sure you update them. And always be flexible, again, especially on the House side. As it says here, if you're meeting with staff, that meeting could take place any number of places. If the member's not around, you could be in his or her office, and that's usually a comfortable situation with seating for everyone. But if that's not the case, you might be right out kind of in the main antechamber. You could be in a small table that's amongst the staff cubicles on the other side of the office, or you might be just standing up in the hallway itself. There's a number of different places those meetings can take place. And the other thing that I would add on to this is if you are meeting with staff, or for those of you who haven't done this much, those staffers tend to be very young people, but don't let that fool you. These are people with a great amount of responsibility and really have the ear of their bosses, the Congress people. So don't let that throw you. And not that you would, but just another thing to keep in mind. And as we've talked about a couple times already, your time is going to be limited. So as Jose was talking about, make sure to order your priorities to make sure you get them in. And with that, back to Carrie.
Thank you, everyone. And speaking of limited time, we have about 8 minutes left and maybe twice as many questions. So we're going to try to rapid fire these as quickly as possible. There might be a couple that we stay on a few minutes past 3 so that we can include them in the recording, but we understand if folks have to drop off. We do have our thank you slide here with opportunities to sign up for communications from each of our associations, and a reminder and save the date for the Advocates in Action event that AACC hosts in September. And then with that, Jose, if you just want to put up the last slide, there are individual emails if you'd like to reach out to us. So as I mentioned, we did type answers to some of the questions in the Q&A box, but we have a number of other questions that we're going to try to talk about live here. So first up, someone notes here that the recent report out from the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, says that we're heading for a 2.7 billion shortfall of the Pell Grant program based on current predictions. How does this impact our lobbying for Pell? You want to jump in, David?
Yeah, it does impact our lobbying for Pell. I mean, the good news of the shortfall, which the question refers to, is the fact that there are more students who are qualifying for Pell grants and they're qualifying for bigger grants. And that's the byproduct of the FAFSA Simplification Act that was passed. And even with all the troubles that we had with implementing the new form the department did, it has ultimately meant that there are going to be more students participating in the program and again, getting more money. So it impacts our lobbying in that we are asking Congress to make sure that they provide all the funding that's necessary to meet the grant needs that are defined in the law and that the Simplification Act put into effect. We didn't get into it on our slides, but one of our hopes is that in the budget reconciliation process that I talked about, I mentioned that there were some possible cuts on the table, as well as possibilities for us to get some additional funds put in there, although those opportunities are going to be limited. One of the things that we would like to see done in reconciliation is to take some of the money that will be cut out of primarily the loan programs and put some of that into the Pell Grant Foundational Program. Members of Congress, both parties, both chambers strongly support Pell. Budget reconciliation is a budget cutting exercise, not a spending expansion exercise. But we do think that because of the broad-based support that Pell has, that we will, we're hopeful anyway, that we'll be able to get some more money into that program. Because the shortfall that was mentioned was $2.7 billion. That's for the fiscal year 2025 that we're in. Looking forward, we're looking at annual shortfalls of about $6 or $7 billion a year relative to the current appropriation. That's for a program that costs less than $30 billion. So we're talking about a significant shortfall that Congress is going to have to address.
Thank you, David. I'll start out tackling the next one, and I'm thinking some of my colleagues are going to chime in as well. But there's a question here and a couple in this vein about how might proposals to dismantle the Department of Education affect our students and institutions, and kind of what have we learned? So let me start first with there's a lot of rumors, information. Now we do have media reports out about what is happening with the president's stated goal from the campaign trail of ending the U.S. Department of Education. What I think we feel most confident in right now is that there will eventually be an executive order on this topic. There seem to be many folks in the Republican Party pushing for that to wait until after Secretary Designate McMahon's confirmation hearing and preferably her vote. And I'll tell you, every time I read or have another person tell me that they heard this or talk to that person, etc., there's slightly different details. So I don't think anyone truly knows what may be in there. And I expect that it will continue to change until it is actually released. I think the most important thing to know is that it does take Congress to eliminate an agency entirely. And so the real question here is, what do they try to do from within to either shift programs or to decrease the size of those programs and the impact of the staff in the various parts of the department. Several of the programs, including all of Title IV aid, are written into statute as being part of the Department of Education. Both the legislation that established the department as well as the Higher Education Act are all tied into those programs, not just statutorily existing, but to their being at the Department of Education. So that is something that, how these maneuvers go, we will be watching very closely, given how that legislation is written. But I will also say we should not undercount the effects that the current leadership is having on the Department of Education staff, kind of in the atmosphere over there. So this is something that we are certainly watching very closely. We'll keep updating our members about, and we'll be talking about at NOS. Any of my colleagues want to add anything to that?
I think that was that's a great account, Carrie. One thing I would just add a little nuance is that, as you said, these programs are designated by statute to be at the Department of Education. The Democrats would need to participate in voting technically the Department of Education out of existence, assuming the retention of the filibuster in the Senate. And so it does become a question of what resources and location within the bureaucracy at the Department of Education these programs are held. And reality is that if there aren't adequate resources provided, it could affect the quality of the services that are offered. And so we're focusing very closely on the resources, the administrative expertise that are brought to bear on these programs. And I think politically, it could be a challenge for the Department of Education, because a lot of our programs are in fact very popular with members of Congress in both parties, including the Republican Party, for sure. And so they like, as I said a few minutes ago, the Pell Grant program. They like the TRIO program. If there is an adequate and efficient administration of those programs, those members of Congress are going to have concerns about it. So I think, we'll be watching it very carefully. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with administration of these, again, very popular programs. The overwhelming majority of funds that are provided to higher education within the Department of Education are the student financial aid programs. And again, those have broad-based support in Congress.
And on a related topic, Jim, you flagged the question. Please share if we should anticipate how Elon Musk may influence the White House legislative priorities, particularly on taxes and funding.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're all finding out in real time what as the question put it, what the Musk factor really is. That's for sure, and that will continue to develop. The one thing I would say outside of Mr. Musk is, just kind of looking back to the first Trump administration, and certainly there is a limitation to which you can make a comparison between the two. But that being said, it was the case that in the first Trump administration that they put forth budgets that contained very extensive cuts to a number of programs that we care about. That was the bad news during the first Trump administration. The good news was that the Congress ignored calls for those cuts. But this is a different scenario, and this is a different time. We got a different makeup of the Congress as well, and we have the wherever it might be, we have the Musk factor. So I think one way that will play out is to see assuming that, and we're going to see in a matter of weeks or months, the first of the Trump administration's budget for FY26, assuming that looks kind of like what we think it might, what will be the congressional reaction to it in terms of comparing or contrasting to how that worked out during the first Trump administration. And then I think, I don't want to speculate in terms of what the factor could be on legislative priorities outside of that. I will mention one thing completely outside of any sort of must factor is one area that we're hoping to see a real positive engagement with the Trump administration in terms of the legislative priorities is workforce Pell. The incoming presumed Secretary of Education Linda McMahon penned an op-ed in favor of workforce Pell last year in the Hill newspaper. So we're hoping to see that translate into stronger administration support for that than we've seen. So there's kind of one area on the plus side of the ledger, but there's new stuff every day. So let's stay tuned.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Jose, I see a couple of different questions in the queue about congressionally directed spending projects or earmarks. Do you want to take what we're expecting to see on that front in this Congress?
Yeah, absolutely. And so just one point of clarity, the earmarks process, the congressionally directed spending process is going to be completely separate from the reconciliation process. It's going to be part of the annual appropriations process, which is as I mentioned, the next deadline is March 14th for lawmakers to either come to an agreement or do another extension. We should expect fiscal year 2025 to still include many of the projects that were published last year during when the House and the Senate unveiled their proposals. The only situation where that might not happen is if there was a member of Congress who sponsored it who did not return to Congress. But even then, I would assume that whoever replaced them would pick up the mantle and push for the inclusion of those projects there as well. So we should still expect to see them. The amount itself might be dependent or will be dependent on that top line agreement and then what share each bill gets from that. As you might remember, the House in particular restricted the eligibility of earmarks for many programs. For example, the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and Related Agencies bill did not allow for any earmarks. Many of our colleges submitted programs through the Transportation, Housing and Urban Development Grant or the Agricultural bill. So there's other places where many of our colleges submitted requests, and we hope and expect to see those as well. There's a question mark around what's going to happen for fiscal year 2026, but this conversation has not taken up much oxygen this time around compared to 2 years ago. 2 years ago, there was a whole back and forth on whether they would ban earmarks in the House rules, for example, the operating rules for the House of Representatives. That did not come as a discussion this time around. There may be still a space where the Appropriations Committee restricts it further, just as they did last year. But I believe there's been a strong bipartisan support for earmarks, as many of the members of Congress from both parties have directed funding to their districts. So I think we should expect to still see them. The size and scope of them is what's going to be the question mark.
Thank you, Jose. We are going to take two more questions. I'm going to try to lump some of them together, and then we will try to type as many answers to the others as possible. And we will put the written or the questions that are answered via typing. We can share those as a document on that resources page, the link that was shared before. Second to last question, I should say, considering the administration's antagonistic approach towards DEI, do you anticipate a rollback of funding for HBCU, HSI, et cetera, institutions?
I can pick that up and then maybe the rest of you fill it in.
Go for it.
I anticipate a proposed rollback from President Trump's budget for sure. Whether Congress follows through on that is a question mark. If you look at the proposal from the House bill last year for fiscal year 2025, which was, as I mentioned, included very steep cuts, it for the most part level funded many of those institutions. Many of those institutions have a lot of champions in Congress, bipartisan champions in Congress, and so we expect the advocacy groups, as well as the institutions themselves, to push back against any proposed cuts, and we expect their congressional champions to push back. I don't foresee major increases in investment, but it is a possibility that Congress may ignore the president's proposal, as they did in the previous Congress. Like Jim mentioned, we are living in a new Congress with a lot of different new representatives and senators, and it's a whole different context. So we don't expect to see a complete repeat of the first Trump administration and how that went about in appropriations, but some of these programs have had long-standing bipartisan support, and I don't necessarily see that going away overnight.
I would
I think
just,
I'll just,
I would
oh,
just
go
add
ahead,
one
Jim.
thing on real generally, because I don't know that we stressed it really quite enough throughout we've talked a lot about the ramifications of Republicans having control of the House and the Senate and the White House, particularly in terms of, at least attempting to do reconciliation legislation. But the other thing that you really need to keep in mind in terms of how a lot of these things will play out, particularly if they keep the filibuster in the Senate, is the very, very thin margins that the Republicans have control by, particularly in the House. When they're at full strength, and they're not right now, but when they are at full strength and everyone's voting, Republicans cannot lose more, and it's a party line issue. They can't lose more than 2 votes and pass legislation along a party line vote. So that is very much going to affect what a reconciliation bill looks like for sure, if they can even get it done. And it very much affects, as we've already seen, even before the Trump administration came in terms of the spending bills and so forth, the types of things that need to be done, and in many cases wound up being deals struck between the parties and passed on a bipartisan vote. So for the things that really do need to get done, you can anticipate more of that happening, and what the ramifications of that might be in terms of internecine fights within the Republican Party. We'll have to see. But that is certainly a factor to really keep in mind, along with all the other stuff we've talked about as you're having your meetings on the Hill next week.
And just really on that theme, our last several questions here are really about that impact of funding. What do we ask Democrats for who aren't in the majority if we mostly have Democratic representatives? How concerned do we need to be about the possibility of losing federal funding or a federal funding freeze? There are a couple others as well. And this is one of the reasons, all of these questions together around funding is why we have really been stressing this year that every college should fill out their federal funds worksheet, use the template on our website, design charts and graphs like the example from the slide David talked about, do whatever works best for you, but make sure your members of Congress understand the impact of those federal dollars on your campus, on your students, ultimately on the economy of the region. And also, that Congress is the one that's supposed to make the decisions about these funding streams. We saw during the first Trump administration, there were several programs that the president recommended for $0 funding, which is another way that without eliminating the Department of Education, you can limit its impact is by not funding the programs. But what we saw in the first administration with that Congress at least, or those 2 Congresses at least, is that most of the time when President Trump recommended $0 for a long respected bipartisan popular program, that Congress said thanks but no thanks and funded it anyway. And we have court cases saying that if Congress funds something, it is the responsibility of the executive branch to administer those programs and funding. So, I think those are areas of, conversation for either party about the importance of these dollars and the importance that Congress is the one making these decisions. Any last comments or any questions any of my colleagues wanted to answer quickly before we say goodbye? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We are looking forward to seeing you next week. As I mentioned, please bookmark that link or go to nls.acct.org and click on the Preparing tab and the Resources tab. There's a lot of great information there. You should have received an email yesterday announcing our speaker lineup. You should receive an email tomorrow to get the app.
Something must have happened to Carrie's signal.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna go ahead and cap off here and say thank you all. Again, you should be receiving a couple of emails. Carrie, you cut off, so I'm not sure where you were at.
My internet connection is unstable. Well, there will be many emails from us this week. One for your registration badge, one for the app, and one you should already have yesterday that includes the vast majority of the speakers. We might have one or two more that we are adding to that. So we are excited to see you soon. I hope everyone has safe travels. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.